Racism is real, but is race real? Is there a biological concept called race which makes a person different from another? Peace Vigil brings to you an in depth interview with a leading expert on the subject, Dr. Rasigan Maharajh. He is not only an authority on the subject of race, but he also comes from a country where this subject has been of paramount importance, South Africa, where race determined your entire life, what rights you had or did not have, what you could or could not achieve. Every single thing in your life was determined by the category of race you were put in. Dr. Rasigan Maharajh was born and raised in South Africa. Rasigan was a student and youth activist against the apartheid regime. He is professor at the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology, Stellenbosch University. He is also the node head of the Department of Science and Technology and National Research Foundation Center of Excellence in Scientometrics and Science, Technology and Innovation Policy. He is the chief director of the Institute for Economic Research on Innovation at the Tshwane University of Technology, all in the Republic of South Africa. Dr. Maharajh is Associate Research Fellow at the TELUS Institute, Boston, United States of America, and he is the chairperson of the Southern African node of the Millennium Project, Republic of South Africa. We now bring to you his interview with Peace Vigil's co-founder, Samir Dosani.
Pleasure to have you with us today. We've been reading about and watching what's happening in the US, and everyone is talking about race and racism. Could you explain a little bit about what race is according to your opinion?
Thanks very much, Samir. Also for the opportunity to share with you some ideas around these issues itself. The issue around race, I think, is very important, very significant, because of exactly how at present we have a major social phenomena that's taking place that's premised on the use of a social construct. It's something we've invented to define ourselves. And having established that framing, we now, within its narrative, are starting to realize the contradictions that arise from it, and constantly a lot of movement towards us resolving these issues.
When you say race is a social construct, can you talk a little bit more about, many people would think that race has a biological basis. Could you talk a little bit more about why you don't believe that's the case?
Absolutely, that there is no biological basis behind the framing of race. And it's very important in recognizing it. Even the term race doesn't exist in language other than about 300 years ago. So our evolutionary history is much longer. Ourselves as a species being arose in a split from other bipedal mammals such as ourselves over a long period of evolution, millions of years. At best, people caricature this to say, or oversimplify it to show, between 13 and 7 million years ago, we split from other great apes, monkeys, bonobos, etc. Between that period and approximately 300,000 years ago, we took many evolutionary forms and established ourselves as hominids, of having a basic structure that's very similar. But we were very small populations, and quite importantly, we were but one adaptation to our environment in a wealth, a plurality of other life forms. In other words, we exist on a planet that we share with different forms of life being constituted with very similar building blocks. To that extent, we are not so different from any other living organism on the planet. But we do have differences, and these differences largely arise, one, in terms of geography, but two, and more importantly, even the term geography comes from our understanding of defining things. In other words, even us calling a name for a place is a consequence of social engagement. So the very concept of geography does not predate us. It is a consequence of us being. So in a similar form, when we look at this notion around race in its particularity, Samir, the taxonomy, the way in which the term has come to be used, derives much from how we categorize everything around us. And here, the history is not that far away from us. We can even come up with very specific dates. So Carolus Linnaeus in 1758 coined the term Homo sapiens. That's our species being named. But until Linnaeus put it down on paper, who were we? We did not have a shared name for ourselves in terms of where we had arisen from. You know, almost about 100 years later, a century later, an eminent scholar, Charles Darwin, wrote The Origin of Species. So that's by 1859, we have that published. Yeah. So in that evolutionary work, it's absolutely clear how a co-evolutionary process leads to adaptations, changes in a genetic structure, and these result in forms in which life is able to extend itself following its pathway of adaptation.
So would it be fair to say, Professor, that humans look different based on their geographies, just because the environment has done things to shape us slightly? I mean, genetically, we're almost identical, all of us. But there are slight variations based on where our ancestors lived and the environments around them. Would that be something that you'd agree with?
Absolutely. We can even quote a famous social biologist, Lee Walton, and 90% of our diversity is as individuals within population groups. These population groups themselves, you know, are 99.9% the same. So it's that very small proportion of difference that actually derives from our adaptation to our climatic and other geographic specifications. Yeah?
Someone who's interested in health and nutrition, I've also been researching into vitamin D and how people who live further from the equator kind of had to evolve paler skin just so that they could process vitamin D. And that those of us who have, you know, we have melanin, but maybe we go to live in northern places and we start having vitamin D deficiencies because our ancestors didn't have that problem.
And it also shows you the temporal nature. So the things that we fixate on now may not be the things that we would look at in 100 years from now, should we survive, that is. And I'm not so certain about that in terms of our social progress. So, you know, with that level of shared characteristics being defined geographically, we remain contesting how we define ourselves as these living organisms. So we often take for granted, Samir, in ordinary general conversations when we make use of the word planet, that we have a shared understanding of what we're speaking about. In a very similar way, a lot of us glibly use the word species. And we assume, well, we constitute a species. And in our species being, we are the last extent of a whole range of hominids that coexisted we don't find any other form of hominid other than Homo sapiens sapiens today. Yeah? So while I say that to you, Samir, we also have to bite a lot of humility in even expressing that. Why? Because right up to 1950, we had 26 rival concepts of what is a species. So I hope we're getting a sense that these things, how we call ourselves, etc., are the consequence of an engagement between each other. We define ourselves in the context within which we find ourselves, but also based on the best available data, the information, the way in which we make sense of this through knowledge.
Yeah. So what I'm picking up from you is that, first of all, the biology is very complicated. Human evolution is fairly complicated and happened in many different places through many different pathways. But second, that none of that makes any sense without some social ordering of the world, which is something that has taken place. The names that you have mentioned all happen to be men of European descent. And so there's a specific knowledge system that we're talking about, both when we talk about the biology of this, but also when we get to the social construct, which I want to get back to soon. Talk a little bit about what does that look like? Why do these European men have this power to name things?
Also, it's important, I think, Samir, both their demographic characteristics, but also their time period. You'll notice in terms of this, when are they writing? You know, it's not that they're writing in the 1400s. And this is common era that I'm speaking about. So they're all writing at approximately the time in which world systems are in major transformation. A geography, the peoples of a particular geography, expand by brute force of violence to incorporate the rest of the planet into that world system. So I'm sorry, I've trespassed over people that write much more poetically, but I hope I've conveyed that image, that the reason why these names are still with us is very much why these statues are still occupying public spaces. That's how these ideas are maintained, reproduced, and transmitted intergenerationally.
So tell me a little bit more about this. So you refer, so the time period, just to be very specific, we're talking about what's called the European Enlightenment, right? The 17th, 18th centuries, right? Whether we accept that term or not is a different thing. 17th, 18th centuries, largely in Europe. And we're talking about people who, in fact, racial theorization is not distinct from the kind of, the phylum, class, order, family, genus, species stuff that we learn in biology, right? In fact, race theory is like a precursor to some of that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about the advent then of a system of production that would underpin many more people being capable of devoting much more time to research as a focused activity. So I also am not comfortable with the term enlightenment because I don't believe in the predecessor being a dark age. So the 1700s in particular sees the advent of industrial capitalism, and various mercantile forms of trade and cottage industry get destroyed as factories, etc., get set up. When you speak about the way in which the clades, the different levels in which population, demographics, etc., are defined, there's also a hierarchical form in which these are expressed. So it's important, at the same time that Marx was writing about capital, another German professor of medicine, actually, Blumenbach, following Immanuel Kant, who's recognized as the first or original scientific racist. Blumenbach is the person who then measured people's skulls, and based on his understanding of skull that we have 5 races that comprise the world. So this idea of the separation and now the use of the term 5 races to define the world's peoples, this is 1790s.
Yeah.
And again, the million years of history to come to something less than 300 years old to define us today is extremely.
I just wanted to mention that the Blumenbach Skulls, I mean, in his defense, I don't think he necessarily intended it this way. But the way that he presented his 5 races, there was actually a 6th race there, which was some kind of a chimp head or an orangutan head or something, which is, so that's why, so it went like, you know, the orangutan head, and then it was the African head, and then the other 4 races, with the Europeans being the farthest away from the orangutan, you see. So I think in his defense, he didn't intend it that way, but implicitly the bias is already there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also, you know, this provides narratives through which, based on a very simple reading of the way in which things have been defined, you can end up with extraordinary consequences. So very much like you described it, you know, I mean, the hierarchy that he saw in terms of the 5 that I had known of, the Americas were the furthest away. And the Americas did not get a racialized term. It was called the Americas. That followed by the Negro, the Malay, the Mongoloid, and the Caucasian being the epitome of authority over this structure. So again, you know, I mean, we look at this, you can look at the time at which it's written and how it lends itself to economic power being concentrated and also then appropriated. So indigenous knowledge holders, people who understood the world, suddenly would find the very way in which they appreciated the world being told back to them, but this time in canonical form. So there is an epistemological capture taking place as much as an economic grab. You know, people are not only losing their land, they are also losing their imagination, the way in which people understood themselves. And that's why, again, a huge crisis that we face is not just what we are seeing symptomatically in the United States of America at the moment, but part of world systems that allow these to continue. Africa being a case. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just wondering, can I just try and encapsulate some of the discussion? So what I'm hearing is that as a process of European conquest and domination, a couple of things were necessary. One was the expropriation of land. Now, in some knowledge systems in the Americas, you didn't have the idea that land could be privately owned, right? In many knowledge systems in the Americas, perhaps the majority. And so taking that specific case, you had to convince someone, not just that the land was yours, but that the way that they saw land was incorrect. So you had to say the way that your understanding of your environment, the way you understand property and so on, is incorrect. My way is correct. And through a process that may take generations, you beat that understanding of land out of that population, and you replace it with your Judeo-Christian understanding, or however we want to explain that. Is that something you'd agree with?
I think that's a very good summary, Samir. As you were putting that together as well, sorry, I was just writing down some notes, because a key idea in this, for one to express dominion, one needs to other. In other words, you need to create something other than yourself. Expressing dominion over yourself is self-hate. And we are seeing that being expressed around us at the moment. But in a broader sense, the othering process, the ability to say some are less equal, can only come from it being an other, not yourself. You see, and that element is a lingering element right across our long evolutionary development, Samir, which predates taxonomy of race and like that. It could be that sense. Our feeling of solidarity, cooperation, the need to nurture in-group characteristics does, to some extent, influence behavior. But how we understand those in-group characteristics, that comes out of the way in which science and knowledge raises this information. And it's through that that such individuals, even though their work in their time was not well known. I mean, Marx did refer to Blumenbach directly, but one doesn't see a huge amount of literature contesting these ideas at their time. But today, they are foundational elements for how we understand race, racialization, and racism. All three of those concepts.
Before we take a jump, I want to talk a little bit about sort of slightly more modern periods and with specific reference to the country, to our country, to South Africa.
Yeah.
But before we go there, there's one element that I think will be missing for our analysis that we would need to explain a little bit. And that is the transatlantic slave trade and how that fits into this picture. So you have a picture of Europeans in the 18th century, especially dominating, conquering the Americas, doing so through a kind of a racialized ideology, also just doing so because they can, and then afterwards justifying it through religious justifications or racial justifications, and probably a combination of the two. But there was also in Europe and more so in the Americas and even more so here in South Africa, there was a need by the European owners, but I mean, we call them owners, I sort of think of them as thieves, the people who were expropriating the resources. There was a need to have labor, people to work the mines, people to work the fields, people to work in brutal conditions in the sugarcane plantations in the West Indies and so on. Can you explain to us a little bit about that period?
Also very importantly, because this praxis, in a strange way, Samir, it's as if societies have been evolving through a multiplicity of experiments that may not be coordinated per se, but eventually derive towards the same form. So the form in which race, racialization, and racism came to occupy South Africa is not so different from all of the colonies of the Commonwealth in particular, but then express a slight cultural nuance with other colonial blocs, even though they were all racist. Yeah. So to some extent, there's a way in which our experience of these concepts have, in a similar form, very similar components to them, even though they are expressed differently. South Africa took the most acute form. In other words, it legislated and enforced through organized state violence the application of racialized theories of being. In other words, without that racial system underpinning it, one cannot understand South Africa at all. There was no South Africa before this was put in place. So importantly, the coincidence between property, the way in which property is formed and understood, and its relationships to people, also influence race, racialization, and racism coming into South Africa. So we have a sense the first private property in this country remains enclosed very similar to its original boundaries, which is the castle in Cape Town. So this is a foreign projection. It's almost like these zones where the hegemon in world systems occupies other countries and establishes a green zone for itself to be safeguarded. I hope we've seen that leap from 1650 to what's happening in 2020.
I see that, but we're far enough away from the Iraq War that I think you should explain that a little bit for people who are a little bit younger than you or I.
I'm sorry for the generational slippage. Yes. So in some of the occupations that have taken place in the last decade and a half, the subservience of the occupied populations has been very difficult to maintain, largely because of the illegitimate manner in which those invasions and occupations have been performed. They've not taken place with consensus, either of those being invaded or the community of nations who should have provided some level of legitimacy for an intervention. Consequences, these are then fortresses that are established to maintain order, where the subject of that ordering process has not asked to be ordered. So it's maintaining a violent system of repression. And the way in which people conduct themselves there, very much through identity cards, barcoded systems, all of this, if we were 300 years before the technology, would we not be using skin color, passbooks, similar types of devices?
And you're saying that all of these were in play in the original Cape Colony founded by the Dutch in the 17th, 18th century here in South Africa.
So maybe I should speak a little bit more about that. So we do have a population history, a human population history of Southern Africa, extending to the origins of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. And we're recognized by the United Nations as hosting a cradle of humankind. Because of that, subspecies diversity. Many hominid species coexisted in South Africa, Southern Africa, for a long period of time. In fact, one can even argue, to the best of our knowledge, all of our origins derive from this geography itself. So these populations, of course, over time, and especially when Homo sapiens sapiens becomes extant in our species, we have now delinked from all other hominid species. Our evolution and evolution to create ourselves as modern, anatomically modern human beings. Yeah. To that extent, the population that existed here was well adapted, both ecologically, which allowed it to reproduce, but importantly, was in harmony with nature to a large extent. The population was not huge relative to the stock of materials available. So the type of lifestyle, the type of way in which the economy of pre-colonial Southern Africa organized itself does not provide us evidence of private appropriation, does not provide us with evidence of individual hoarding and the accumulation of wealth. We do not see elements of that. But we do see from the time that the Dutch established the castle as their refreshment station en route to the East Indies, that subsequent to that, the expansion from that, again, an anomaly language-wise, Samir, the people that did the expanding were called free burghers, free citizens. In other words, not bound by the corporate structure that established the Cape as a colony at its time. Yeah. But this expansion then basically began to enclose land, very much like the enclosure movement in Europe. Certain landmarks were identified and the territories within it basically became forms of private property owned by these free burghers initially, but then subsequently traded and sold on. So there is an original sin in Southern Africa, and we can trace it back corporally to this physical property, because prior to that, we have no evidence of any private property existing in the territory. Yeah. So all that we've seen since then to reach a situation where we are today, where the generations of indigenous peoples of the territory have so little, both in terms of income or wealth or property. None of these three forms exist in abundance amongst the majority Black population of Southern Africa. And the reason for that is their exclusion from proprietary rights. So while this takes place intergenerationally, the community that we know as white South Africans were able to accumulate wealth and transfer this wealth over generations. Hence, this small group of the population, approximately 6 to 7% of the population, holds almost 70 to 80% of the wealth of the territory, whereas 94% of the population has access to less than huge amounts of land. It's, I think in percentage terms, it's not even 20% of the land at present.
Yeah. So Rasigan, just I'm interested in talking just for a minute about pre-1948. So the Republic of South Africa does not exist. There's a man called Cecil John Rhodes, who we read about in our history books, and there's been a lot of debate about that particular individual. He's involved in something called a Land Act. I'm forgetting the exact date. It might have been 1915 or something like this.
1913.
1913, yes. That is, so it's as recently as 100 years ago that you have mass expropriation of land, people being kicked off their land. And then subsequent to that, which was really Rhodes's whole argument, I don't know if it was an argument, it was what he wanted, because he was a mining magnate. He wanted the labor, right? So his point was, you push people off their land, remove them from the means of production, remove them from, and they'll have no choice but to come and work for me, right? Talk to me a little bit about how that sort of labor exploitation and race and class, how is that all kind of merged in the South African story?
Yeah, for those of us with the higher melanin content, Samir, this was a confluence. It wasn't a perfect storm, but its impact was pretty bad. So the reason I say that is because all of these elements were utilized, but they were utilized essentially for that economic purpose. And upon that economic purpose itself, a whole social narrative, which had deeply religious and other implications attached to it, were mobilized for ensuring this hierarchy. And the hierarchy was the settler community occupied the apex, and the overwhelming majority then provided the means towards that apex position being maintained. And I would argue that the expansion into Southern Africa by settlers from the Cape took a long period of time, but essentially followed very much what was happening in the USA or Australia, for that matter. These particular dominions, Canada as well, where territories were appropriated, resettled, and then taxes applied. So Rhodes would eventually be a prime minister, but in his original landing in Southern Africa was, as say, a mining magnate. So he required labor to dig up the mineral wealth, and encouraging people who had, as we had spoken about before, occupied an ecological niche of being in nature without huge amounts of catastrophe. In other words, surviving. There was no particular need to move off the land and offer your labor in return for wages. So the use of the state, the use of political force to enforce taxation as a means to proletarianize South Africa's indigenous people. But this was the second way of trying to draw on labor. The first wave, Samir, was slaves. So slaves were brought into South Africa from the rest of Africa, but largely the quadrant from South India heading towards Malaysia, and I would suggest the Philippines. So what was then known as Java, coming across the Indian Ocean. Slaves were collected from all over, and they were collected into Cape Town. So we've got this diversity of people being drawn from these different territories in the first wave of slavery. They performed then the labor that was required from the initial settlers. As the numbers of the settlers increased, they needed larger numbers of people working, and that with the abolishment of slavery, mechanisms were put in place, particularly to drive the local people off the land itself. And the Union of South Africa was only proclaimed in 1910. And in 1913, the Land Act then made this very specific allocation. And it's important, very important, Samir, as you point out as well. This is not the Afrikaner nationalists who take power in 1948. This is still 1910. And in 1910, the Union of South Africa is part of the Commonwealth of Britain. It's a colonial.
So if I'm understanding correctly, there are elements that we don't need to get into here, but trade in enslaved peoples is ended in the British Empire in the 1830s, 1840s, somewhere around there, yeah? And
Well, if you don't mind, Samir, especially with us, the gap between what was abolished, what was no longer legal, versus much of my ancestry is only from 1860. In other words, indenture is seen as a continuation of.
Yeah, could you just repeat the point about indenture?
Yeah, so while slavery was abolished in the British Empire early in the 1800s, the British colonial power, the political apparatus, paid reparations to slave owners for the slaves. But the system of unfree labor did not end there. So through other means, people tried to induce a similar form of behavior. And indenture provided one of the ways in which, especially most of my ancestry, is derived from South India.
Yeah.
And they would have come through an indentured form in 1860.
And the British, of course, the British sort of changed the rules as that was going on to make it harder and harder for people to leave indenture. And this, in fact, was one of the things we discussed in our recent seminar on Gandhi. One of the things, one of the issues that he took up when he was here in South Africa. Yeah. But through this long history, the long and the short of it is that by making these forms of indentured servitude and enslavement of peoples more difficult, in the end, the politics here in Southern Africa was building towards a perceived need on the Europeans to displace masses of Black people, of African people here, so that they would have more labor, because their labor supplies were getting more expensive, because slavery and its replacements were no longer viable. Is that more or less the story?
That's more or less the story. It's more in terms of, as I said, the owners. It's far less in terms of those that were subject to these systems. It's just a play on words. But 100%. In essence, because often this is not factored in. Slave owners did not lose from the end of slavery. So they were compensated for the property that they were losing. The human beings that were categorized as property gained nothing.
Yeah, the property was your ancestors.
There you go. So, but and I think that's why it's so germane today. Also making this link back, without reparations, the idea that people are operating at the same level of advantage or disadvantage is completely impossible to comprehend.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that, I think we're going to have to. Can we fast forward a little bit? So we already had, as we said, we didn't have the makings of the system. We already had a very detailed and hierarchical racialized caste system in place in South Africa, or what would become South Africa, prior to 1948. But in 1948, something does change. And I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about what that change is and how you perceive, as someone who, in your student days and so on, you were an anti-apartheid activist. Tell us about what did that mean, both from its origin all the way through to its destruction in 1994, supposed destruction in 1994.
So, 1948, and a very slim margin of a whites-only election resulted in a particular group, a fraction of the white community, gaining political power. And this fraction was socially conservative, deeply aligned with Calvinist principles, but they then expanded what was called in South Africa grand apartheid. So all which had existed largely by laws in place were now made more difficult. What had existed as practice were given legal impetus to actually take place. In other words, they became budgeted activities. So no longer was it just a case of, well, if you are born in a particular territory, you belong to a particular ethnic group. It now became enforceable that if you were in a territory not designated for that ethnic group, you had to have specific permission. That's the pass laws. So you had to carry with you the equivalent of a passport inside your own country to be in different areas. Some of this was really ridiculous, Samir. So you end up with not only families being split up, but largely those involved in actually selling their labor for wages being constituted by males in urban areas. So you end up with single sex facilities, the breakup of the way in which society is actually being created, where people earn wages and then send remittances to people left behind in homelands that they then need to sustain by selling their labor. But this system was impossible to maintain in that form. 1956 and the Group Areas Act come into place. And here, what you see created is a realization of what the 19th Land Act had set in place. Except on the basis and keeping with the Jim Crow laws in the USA, the idea of separate development gets induced into the lexicon. So in other words, now it's no longer just this hierarchy with white on the top, black at the bottom, but there's ways in which the enforcement of this would drive particular behaviors and reinforce what was ostensibly eroding because of the country's demography itself. So things like the Immorality Act gets passed that basically prescribes people categorized as being in different races from having relationships. You can imagine the policing of such a function. And you had elements of the police force designated particularly to break up couples who were categorized differently.
So this wasn't just marriage. This is, I could be holding someone's hand walking down the street and cops would beat us up or something.
Well, you'd be arrested. You'd be stopped from holding the hand to start off with. And then you'd be investigated for why were you holding the hand. And note, Samir, it would have been you holding the hand, notwithstanding anything else. Because there's this racist perception as well in terms of how that would be framed. And Black people in general would be seen as having committed a crime. In the South African law, this became the way we understood it. you're black, you had to prove you were innocent. In other words, you had to disprove your guilt for most of the petty apartheid laws. The onus wasn't to prove that you were doing something wrong. You had to prove you were doing something right.
And do you think, sorry, this is an aside, but do you think what we're seeing today with so much police brutality in the US directed at people of color, especially black men, even though on paper we know that in the US the system is that all people are innocent until proven guilty. Do you feel that this may have an echo there, that people are actually, because they're black, there's a presumption of guilt?
Personally, I have actually felt this, even in the US. So you have a sense of an eye being kept on you because of your darker skin tone. I should tell you, once my hoodie comes off and people realize my hair is a little straighter, that gets moderated down a little bit. But the initial feeling of seeing a dark face walking around, even in the shop, sort of generates that sense of surveillance over me. Yeah? In a similar form, the way in which the origins of this institutional form, the police, needs a little more attention. It's not the same as the legal system. And I think we've got to differentiate. There are other instruments through which legal systems can be maintained, and they don't need to take the form of a police. The police in their origins chase slaves. So in terms of that, trying to wash out the slave chasing component is proving how impossible it actually is.
Yeah.
And therefore, I strongly support the move that we need to rethink. We tried to do this in South Africa. In Mandela's first government, we did not have a designation for a police service. We put a Ministry of Safety and Security, in which there were both civilian and a more force-orientated structure. But the object was safety and security, not policing or maintaining the law. So under capitalism, the state plays a particular role. Some argue that governments then constitute the executive committee of capitalist rule. To that extent, the police is but the security guards on this factory.
Yeah. I think, Professor, we might have to have you back to have a separate and longer discussion just on the police and the use of force and so on. But for the current moment, just let's focus on a couple of questions. So we had this extremely legalistic apartheid system. It was trying to enforce things that had no reality. There's no such thing as race. But there is such a thing as power. And so the power that you're giving to the police to separate a black and a white hand on the street, that's real. And that can be enforced with guns and with sticks and so on, right? So you have a very brutal, a very legalistic regime, but also a very unsustainable regime, as you've already pointed out. And I think if it were not for the support from the US because of Cold War politics, that we don't need to get into it, it might have fallen much more quickly. But by the late 1980s, it's pretty clear that it's beginning to fall apart. And you or people that you know were part of discussions in Lusaka and South Africa, elsewhere, that were talking about what the transition to a post-apartheid regime might look like. And what was the thinking about how, if you have such a deeply, as you say, there was no South Africa before there was racism, or even legalized racism. Given that that's the history, what was the thinking around trying to transition to a post-apartheid South Africa?
I think something that's quite important, I think, for at least the listeners to also engage with Samir, is we did not have a monolithic liberation movement. So in other words, at least the argument for what a post-apartheid Africa would look like was significantly influenced from the strand of fighting apartheid that you had vested yourself in. So if you were fighting apartheid on the basis of class antagonisms, and you were arguing we need to destroy capitalism to build a post-apartheid state, the approach was radically different from those that believed apartheid was but a fetter on capitalism. In other words, apartheid inhibited capitalism from taking a bigger form. So it's between that spectrum itself that you had a whole range of views being expressed. And South Africa did take a more conciliatory process, which allowed an internal negotiation amongst different forces. Unfortunately, not all of that, this sort of organizing in a way in which you are permanently negotiating alternatives was difficult to sustain, especially because of those that held the wealth were more interested in how is their wealth going dealt with in the future. And as soon as guarantees were provided that they would not be nationalized, socialized, or redistribution, a lot of the more progressive elements around change got watered down very significantly. And the consequence of that, the time reform required during the transition has now morphed into the demands for transformation in the pandemic that we are confronted by. In other words, what we have now, again, facing us directly at this moment, is the accumulation of ill-spent efforts at reforming things that are incapable of being reformed, that needed to be completely defunded and reconstructed in terms of what people require for their lives, not
Fantastic.
making the old artifice work in a different context.
Yeah, I just want to dig a little bit deeper, because if we say that it's incapable of being reformed, to me, the implication of that is saying that racialized capitalism still exists. It has survived apartheid. Is that a statement you would agree with? And if so, why?
I would maintain the post-apartheid process of reconstruction and development did not eradicate racial capitalism. It attempted to de-racialize capitalism. But that was its attempt. That's not the result. And the result we can find in empirical data that shows us who owns what, who occupies management and leadership positions. A whole series of markers like this will show us that it is not a hugely transformed society. Even though on paper, people have access to rights, those rights are not manifest in a better quality of life.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's a couple of things to say here. I mean, I guess, the spatial geography of apartheid still exists to a large extent, but it is also the case that you have, at least in the middle class areas, the traditionally white areas, you do have people of different races living there, albeit at a very, very small, low percentages, right? So I guess if I'm trying to play devil's advocate and trying to say, no, Professor, there has been transformation. South Africa today, I'm not going to be beaten up for holding a white person's hand and walking down the street. I'm not going to be, I can open bank accounts, I can start businesses as a Black person, et cetera, et cetera. What would be your response to those kind of arguments?
The racialized categories, if the object was deracialization, by now we should not have a concept of a Black South African or a white South African. We should have South Africans. The very fact that we have to continue speaking about white South Africans and Black South Africans, to me, shows the failure of sustained anti-racist work I think we've done a lot celebrating non-racialism and what non-racialism affords us. To that extent, we've largely built a multiracial society. But multiracialism is still running against science. There aren't races, they are only people. So we need to transcend even the social categorization of multiracialism through very direct anti-racist work. And that's the major task facing us, not just in South Africa, but across the world. We must be anti-racist, not just assume that non-racialism will present itself based on our knowledge base.
Fantastic. And can you talk to us, you mentioned a little bit earlier about the current moment with the coronavirus and so on, and the demands for transformation. Just as a closing comment, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the networks you're part of? What are the demands? What would radical transformation in this moment look like? Radical anti-racist transformation.
So I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is the level and pace at which transformation has been advanced is insufficient relative to the challenges that confront people. As you mentioned, spatial dislocations right through to epistemological theft. This coexists concurrently. We have students who are first generation to be at a post-school education and training system. This is 30 years since apartheid has ended. And we are starting to see people come to systems at the moment. But while I say that, the equivalent grant being offered to people that have no jobs, that have no access to other forms of state support on a monthly basis is 350 Rand. This is impossible for anyone to consider surviving on, let alone being utilized. So we really need to up our game in terms of being able, this crisis has shown us huge concentrations of poverty, of underdevelopment, of being disconnected from South Africa as a whole. This opportunity that's afforded to us is to redress those issues. I listened in quite a lot of detail to a presentation made by National Education, Health and Allied Workers Union about the situation at APE in Durban. And in listening to the conditions, and it kind of captured for me the question as you've posed it, Samir. So on site in the hospital, you have segregation, nursing staff, all medical practitioners are isolated. They've now got green zones, yellow zones, and red zones. Not like the occupation forces elsewhere. This is in the hospital. Red zones being COVID positive, green being not, and then the ones in between. They've managed to enforce that, because this was the main source of transmission initially, when the protocols were not in place. They've now policing that system. Except this hospital is in a white suburb, and the majority of staff travel to it using public transport. There is no segregation on the public transport. So people that are working in areas where you have people positive with COVID-19 are then mixing with the rest of the community. So I hope this comes across in that way. I'm sorry, it's a bit odd in framing it in that way. But you can contain the pandemic where you have the resources to do so. But we've got to now, I think, move beyond just being at war with the virus towards accepting this viral contagion affects all of the ways in which we understand we've structured our lives.
Yeah.
We've got to rethink many elements of it until we get a better way of dealing with the COVID itself, COVID-19 itself.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I just want to wrap up our discussion, if I may. So I think there's a couple of themes I'd like to highlight. The first theme is as you've just said, there is no scientific or biological basis to the racial categories that exist, whether in South Africa or the United States. So I think that's one theme that's come from our discussion. I think a second theme is that these categories had been imposed partly through pseudoscience, although the science was never very strong, even at the time, but more because it served a certain kind of social function originally. And the third point is that those social functions continue today, right? The purpose of the police, again, to go back to that institution, is partly to separate the haves from the have-nots. And whether that line is a black and white line or it's a slightly more colored line, that will vary on the context. But that key role will not change in many societies, in nearly any society that has a traditional police force. This is the third theme, and I think the fourth theme is that we need to move to something better. And what the something better looks like, I think that's a discussion that we're all having. Anything you'd like to add by way of conclusion?
No, I fully support your summary, Samir. I want to encourage on the last component itself, even though we have to co-construct based on us being in engagement, there are things that we can agree we don't want to continue into our future. And these are the things like caste, like race, like concepts that have basically prevented us realizing the type of world we want and can possibly build.
Fantastic. Professor Rasigan Maharajh, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Samir.
As part of Peace Vigil's interviews, you were listening to Is Race Real? A conversation with Dr. Rasigan Maharajh. All our interviews are available on our YouTube channel, Peace Vigil, along with our other videos. You can know more about our work on peacevigil.net. And just a reminder, peace needs all of us. Please remember to subscribe to our channel. If you have questions or comments, feel free to write to us. Thank you.